Morning at Ashford Park always felt like a portrait. Mist curling around the roses, light pooling on the centuries-old stones, the world poised in quiet perfection before the daily rhythms took hold. But this dawn was anything but serene. The sky had barely shifted from indigo to pewter when chaos shattered the stillness. It began with a crash, a flurry of hooves against wet grass, the sharp rattle of an old gate wrenched off its latch, and the sight of Sterling, the odd Gypsy Cob, bursting from the stable yard like a storm unloosed. His mane, still dusted with straw from the night, streamed in the wind as he barreled across the dewy fields. He was an unusual sight, a horse with the swagger of a dog, barreling forward not with a whinny, but a guttural bark that rang out, impossible to ignore. The Exmoor pony herd grazed peacefully at the far end of the field, their heads dipping into the long grass, tails flicking at the first light gnats. Their calm vanished in an instant as Sterling approached. Instead of slowing, he sped up, splaying his legs in a playful bow, like the collies that had raised him, and let loose a deep, rumbling bark. Ponies scattered in every direction, nostrils flaring, muscles tensing, kicking up divots of sod as they fled the confusion. The leader of the herd, a dark stallion with a crooked blaze, pivoted and faced Sterling, teeth bared, eyes burning with challenge. The standoff lasted seconds. The stallion lunged, hooves flying, striking Sterling square in the shoulder and sending him tumbling into a thorny hedgerow. Brambles tore at his mane, and a bright splash of blood appeared on the stark white hair, vivid against the morning's gloom. From behind the black iron fence, the resident dogs, Barney the wise, old border collie, Poppy the ever-energetic Jack Russell, and Hector the gentle Labrador, stood tense, watching with concern and confusion. Barney paced along the rail, gaze locked on Sterling. Poppy barked, a sharp warning, while Hector whined softly, pressed against the fence as if urging Sterling to get up. Sterling struggled to his feet, legs trembling, the bramble wounds staining his chest. He moved with a stubborn resilience, head low, ears twitching at every new noise. The bark, once confident, turned raw and uncertain as he limped back toward his canine family. Blood streaked down his mane, dripping onto the grass, a trail of crimson leading back toward the house. The dogs pressed close when he reached them, their presence forming a protective barrier between him and the rest of the world. At the manor, Victoria Ashford was jolted by the commotion. She rushed outside, heart pounding, boots barely laced, her riding coat thrown over pajamas. Her eyes locked on Sterling's injured form, and without a pause, she vaulted the fence and reached his side. She pressed her hand to his neck, feeling the frantic pulse beneath the skin, and quickly began to check his injuries. Her own breath caught as she wiped blood from his fur, anger and worry burning inside her. The dogs gathered around, sensing the seriousness, and together they formed a strange tableau. A woman in flannel and mud, a wounded horse who thought he was a dog, and 3 loyal canines standing watch. Through the haze of morning, staff and stable hands arrived. Whispers buzzed through the group. Words like strange, dangerous, and that horse isn't right floated on the cold air. Victoria ignored them, focusing on Sterling, murmuring words of comfort as she cleaned the wound, determined and gentle. The manor's windows filled with faces, curious and judgmental, and from the grand balcony, Lady Caroline Beaumont observed the scene, her expression unreadable, arms folded tightly as if holding in some private disappointment. Sterling leaned into Victoria, drawing strength from her hands and her steady voice. Every so often, he'd turn his head and look at the dogs, as if expecting them to solve the problem or at least share his confusion. The herd of Exmoor ponies, meanwhile, remained at a distance, their leader watching with suspicion, stamping the ground, nostrils wide. Time seemed suspended in those moments, the only movement the trembling of Sterling's legs, the shiver of Victoria's hands, and the shifting clouds overhead. But the world continued its relentless spin. The news of the morning's incident spread quickly among the staff and across the small villages surrounding Ashford Park. Gossip grew, stories twisting with each telling, a horse gone mad, a scandal in the making, Ashford's odd girl at the center once more. But as the morning light grew stronger, and Victoria led Sterling toward the safety of the old stone stable, the dogs trailing at her heels, there was a different kind of energy stirring at Ashford Park. Underneath the worry, the confusion, and the whispers, there pulsed something fierce and hopeful, an understanding that this misfit family, as battered and unorthodox as it was, held fast to each other in a world that demanded conformity. And beyond the estate walls, in a shadowy pub far down the road, a man listened intently to tales of the morning's chaos. Darren Cole, leader of the local gang, made a note in his mind. A horse that barks, a place with secrets and money, an opportunity. He grinned, slow and sharp, and nursed his drink as the rain began to fall harder outside. At Ashford Park, The day carried on. Blood was washed from Sterling's mane, Victoria's hands stung from the brambles, and the dogs rested close, always within reach. The sky remained low and gray, but beneath it, something new and wild was taking root, a story of defiance and difference, one not so easily uprooted, no matter how much the world tried. The stage was set, the boundaries between ordinary and extraordinary already blurring, and the first act had barely begun. You said, "Hey Viet Fan, 2900 tu do len, Viet Lien mach cao tu, dung quin ngon ngu tieng an mai cho toi het kak fan theo dan I toi da gui." ChatGPT said, "Certainly. Here's part 2, written continuously in American English over 900 words, following your outline and style. Minimal dialogue, rich in atmosphere, emotion, and narrative drive. Underscore, 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 underscore. Part 2, The Night of Snow and the Cost of Compassion. 3 years before the chaos at Ashford Park, winter came to the Cotswolds like a slow, relentless tide. The fields vanished beneath a thick, suffocating blanket of snow, trees bowed with the weight, and the sky pressed low and colorless against the earth. The world was hushed, the silence broken only by the whistling wind and the distant cry of a fox, an animal Victoria Ashford had once been called to treat before everything changed. That night, Victoria walked alone through the blizzard, each step crunching through drifts that reached her knees, her breath hanging in the icy air. Her old tweed coat offered little protection from the bitter cold, but it was all she had. The world she had known, one of privilege, respect, and the comfort of tradition, had unraveled quickly after the tribunal. The sting of disgrace still ached beneath her skin, every glance in the village, every gossiping whisper, a reminder that she had become the Ashford who broke the rules. In the heart of the storm, a desperate, thin cry slipped through the wind. Victoria stopped, straining to hear. She stood for a moment, her heart racing. It came again. A weak, pleading sound, impossible to ignore. The wind drove snow into her face as she moved toward the hedge at the far end of the field, guided by nothing but instinct and the stubborn refusal to turn away from suffering. There, half buried in a drift, she found him. A foal, so small he seemed to disappear under the weight of the snow, legs splayed awkwardly, body shuddering in shock and fear. His sides heaved with every ragged breath, steam curling from his nostrils. Blood streaked his flank from a fresh wound, likely a dog or fox attack, the white in his mane already freezing into icicles. He tried to stand but collapsed again, his strength nearly spent. Victoria dropped to her knees, her own troubles forgotten in an instant. She peeled off her coat, wrapping it tightly around the foal, shielding him from the worst of the wind. Her hands found his face, cold as stone. She pressed her cheek to his neck, sharing what little warmth she could. Her voice was only a whisper, but it was steady. She spoke not to soothe herself, but to anchor him to the world. Her hands massaged his legs, working life back into the numb muscles. The snow stung her bare arms, but she didn't flinch. Her breath mingled with his, each exhale a promise that she would not leave. Suddenly, shadows moved through the snow behind her. 3 loyal shapes emerged from the gloom. Barney, fur dusted with white, his eyes sharp and calm. Poppy, bounding and shivering, energy undiminished by the cold. Hector moving slower now, but steady, his warmth a living shield. The dogs pressed in around the foal and Victoria, their bodies forming a circle, their faith in her unwavering. In that small island of life, the world shrank to a single desperate mission: keep the foal alive until morning. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. The snow thickened, turning the field into a blank, endless sheet. Victoria checked the foal's breathing, watched the slow rise and fall, felt his shivers begin to ease. Her own fingers turned numb, her jaw aching with cold, but she refused to move. The dogs, sensing her resolve, huddled tighter. Barney watched her face, taking silent cues. Poppy nudged the foal's ear with her nose. Hector's tail swept across the snow in slow, patient arcs. As dawn threatened to break, headlights flared on the distant road. A neighbor's battered Land Rover, summoned by Victoria's frantic call earlier in the night. Together, they loaded the foal onto a makeshift sled, blankets piled atop him. The journey back to Ashford Park was slow and silent, every rut in the snow a test of hope and patience. The house lights glowed weakly through frost-covered windows. Inside, warmth waited, but so did judgment. The foal was installed in a stable stall, Victoria refusing to leave his side even as the staff muttered about risks and regulations. Her fingers, stiff with cold, continued to work, cleaning wounds, checking pulse, murmuring encouragement as the foal drifted between fever and exhaustion. She named him Sterling, a name that spoke not of purity but of resilience, the kind found in tarnished silver, in things battered and beautiful. Word of Victoria's act spread fast. The council was swift to respond. The next week she was summoned, standing before a semicircle of stern faces. Their disappointment felt colder than the snowstorm she'd endured. She listened as they cited bylaws, spoke of order and precedent, but Victoria's eyes never left the window, where Sterling, alive, bandaged, and defiant, stood watching the world as if daring it to break him again. The verdict was swift. Her suspension would stand, her reputation further stained. Lady Caroline received letter after letter, friends and strangers alike weighing in on the scandal of the Ashford girl, who defied authority. Even so, Victoria did not regret her choice. Each night she visited Sterling, feeding him, tending his wounds, watching as the dogs taught him the rules of their world. Sometimes she caught him trying to bark, a deep, awkward rumble that startled the other horses and made Barney wag his tail in approval. Winter loosened its grip. Sterling survived, and so did Victoria, though the cost was plain on both of them. In every scar along his leg, in every awkward step, she saw her own reflection. Someone remade by hardship, shaped by compassion. From that night forward, their fates were entwined. The woman who had lost everything for kindness, and the horse who would never quite fit, each holding the other steady as the world spun on. And as dawn warmed the stable roofs, Victoria knew she would choose compassion again, no matter the price. You said, "Hey viet pain, 3900 tu dolen, viet lien mach cao to, dung quen gon ngu tiing an mi cho toi het kak fan, theoden yi toi da gu," ChatGPT said. Absolutely. Here is part 3, over 900 words, written in continuous American English with minimal dialogue, rich in mood, movement, and character emotion, as the next chapter at Ashford Park unfolds. Underscore, 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 part 3. The boy who would not speak. Ashford Park held its breath on the morning Major Arthur Grant and his grandson arrived. Rain misted the air, softening the outlines of the fields and garden beds, the old manor casting a silent watch from the top of the rise. The gravel drive, slick from a night of drizzle, bore the weight of an aging Land Rover, its olive paintwork dulled by years of use, its engine rumbling until it finally sputtered to a stop beneath the shadow of the tallest chestnut tree. A sense of newness crept into the house and stables even before the vehicle's doors opened. Major Grant's steps, careful and stiff from the wounds that war had gifted and time had refused to mend, carried him out first. He took a long look at the grounds, his gaze steady, gathering details with the discipline of a soldier and the hope of a man seeking peace. Behind him, Elliot hesitated. The boy's world had become a narrow lane of silence since the accident, a sudden, final closing of doors on childhood's easy laughter. At 11, Elliot seemed younger and older at once. His face was thin, shadowed beneath unruly brown curls, his eyes downcast but always alert. In one hand, he clutched a faded backpack, worn at the seams, and in the other, he held tightly to Ranger's harness, the Malinois sitting alert and unmoving, a lifeline of quiet reassurance. They crossed the yard, boots and paws muffled by the wet earth. The usual sounds of the morning, the calls of birds, the whinnies from the stables, even the yapping of the dogs, seemed to hold back, giving space to this unfamiliar presence. The dogs, always the first to greet any newcomer, sensed something different. Barney stood watchful, ears forward, measuring the visitors. Poppy hovered at Victoria's heels, her energy contained for once. Hector lay in his favorite spot by the kitchen steps, head resting on his paws, eyes following every movement. Victoria met them at the gate. She welcomed the Major with a nod, her face calm but her mind already measuring how this new energy would settle into the fragile balance of her household. Elliot kept his distance, half shielded behind his grandfather and the dog. The world for him was something to be endured, not entered. Inside the house, the day moved at a gentler pace. The Major carried their few bags up the stairs, settling into the small attic room Victoria had prepared. Elliot hovered by the window, his hand always resting on Ranger's head. The boy watched the drizzle streak the glass, eyes tracking the distant movement of ponies across the far field, and the shapes of Sterling and the dogs weaving among them. Victoria left them to settle, busying herself in the stables, but she watched the house with an instinct born from years of tending wounded things. Outside, the rain lightened. The day shifted. There was work to be done, a broken fence to mend, a lamb caught in the hedge to free, and always the routines of grooming, feeding, mucking out. The park itself became a kind of welcome, not with words, but with purpose, and the slow, certain reassurance that life here went on. By afternoon, Elliot wandered to the yard, Ranger beside him. He watched the dogs play their strange games with Sterling, who mimicked their bows and feints, his heavy hooves thudding against the turf. The boy moved with careful, measured steps, his shoulders tight, gaze flicking from the animals to the humans and back again. He didn't join in, but he lingered, and the dogs, sensing his presence, adjusted their play. Barney circling close, Poppy dropping a stick at his feet before darting off again. Hector ambled over, pressing his damp nose to Elliot's hand, staying just long enough to let the boy know he was seen. In the fading light, Major Grant took up a post by the paddock fence, repairing a loose rail. His hands, though scarred and rough, moved with a steadiness that spoke of years of discipline. Victoria joined him briefly, offering tools and quiet company. They worked mostly in silence, but a sense of understanding built slowly, like a bridge laid stone by stone. Here, neither required explanations. The land, the chores, the rhythm of animal care spoke for them. As dusk began to fall, Elliot found himself drawn closer to the heart of the farm. He trailed Ranger to the stable, where Sterling stood in his stall, head over the door, eyes bright with curiosity. For a moment, horse and boy regarded one another. Sterling's breath warm, his gaze unblinking. Elliot's fingers tight on Ranger's fur. The dog gave a low, reassuring whine, and Sterling responded with a soft, rumbling sound, not quite a neigh, not quite a bark. Something about the horse's presence, the dogs at his side, and the stillness of the evening loosened something in the boy. He reached out, slowly, laying a hand on Sterling's muzzle. The horse leaned in, accepting the touch, his entire body radiating gentle patience. The connection, fragile and silent, hung in the air. Behind them, the dogs watched with quiet approval, their tails wagging in slow, contented arcs. Victoria glimpsed the scene from the doorway and let herself hope that maybe, just maybe, Ashford Park would be the ground where broken things could mend, if given enough time and kindness. The evening deepened. The house filled with the ordinary rituals of supper and rest, the clatter of dishes, the shuffle of tired feet. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean, new, and open to possibility. In his attic room, Elliot drew pictures in his notebook, sketches of dogs, of horses, of wild fields, and for the first time in many months, he let his pencil fill the silence with hope. You said, "Hey Viet Fan, 4902 Do Len, Viet Lien Mach Cao Tu, Dung Quin Ngon Ngu Tieng, An Mai Cho Toi, Het Kak Fan, Theo Dan Yi Toi Da Gi," ChatGPT said, "Certainly. Here's part 4, over 900 words, written in continuous American English, with minimal dialogue, focusing on mood, movement, and the gradual weaving together of lives at Ashford Park, as per your outline and advanced storytelling requirements. Underscore, 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 underscore. Part 4. A new rhythm at Ashford Park, at Ashford. With the arrival of Major Grant and Elliot, Ashford Park settled into a new kind of rhythm, a gentle blend of old routines and subtle shifts. The world outside was still gripped by spring's lingering chill, but within the bounds of the estate, change came quietly. Like the first cautious buds on the rose bushes, tentative but insistent. Mornings began earlier now, the household stirring before sunrise. Victoria found herself rising with anticipation instead of dread, her steps lighter as she walked out into the crisp air. She moved through the stables, tending each horse in turn, but her eyes always lingered a moment longer on Sterling. He greeted her with a low nicker and a playful nudge, often accompanied by Barney's dignified presence or Poppy's eager circles at his feet. The absence of tension was almost startling. The animals seemed to sense the possibility of something good just out of reach. Elliot emerged each day with Ranger at his side, his movements silent but purposeful. He rarely spoke, but there was an alertness to his gaze, a slow awakening that showed in the way he watched the animals, the way his fingers moved with careful intent as he helped with small tasks, sweeping the stable aisle, carrying fresh hay, refilling water buckets. The work became his language, and the stables his safe haven. Sometimes he lingered by Sterling's stall, sketchbook balanced on his knee, capturing the gentle curve of the horse's neck, the playful tilt of Poppy's head, or the quiet strength in Barney's eyes. Major Grant took naturally to the rhythm of the place. He mended fences, repaired sagging gates, and never shied from the heavy lifting. His limp was more pronounced some days, but he never complained. Victoria often caught sight of him walking the boundary, eyes scanning the fields, both a guardian and a man searching for a new kind of peace. Occasionally he paused to watch Elliot, his expression caught between hope and regret, but he never rushed the boy, letting the gentle order of the farm do its slow, healing work. The dogs remained at the center of every scene, their loyalty both a comfort and a balm. Barney established himself as Elliot's quiet shadow, always present, never demanding. Poppy brought bursts of energy to the slowest afternoons, her joyful leaps drawing reluctant smiles from everyone who crossed her path. Hector moved slower now, a dignified presence, his calm steadying the rest, especially Sterling, who still sometimes startled at loud noises or sudden movements. For Victoria, the simple moments took on new weight. She watched as Elliot and Sterling grew used to one another's presence, the boy more willing each day to stand a little closer, to offer a quiet touch or a scrap of apple from his pocket. She noticed how Sterling responded, not just with gratitude, but with a kind of gentle protectiveness, lowering his head for Elliot to stroke, standing sentinel if the boy seemed uneasy. There was a trust building between them, fragile but real, a silent understanding that had little to do with words. Some days, Lady Caroline Beaumont made her rounds through the estate, her presence always elegant, her gaze always assessing. She never failed to greet Victoria with a measured nod, her approval quiet but evident in the way she lingered to observe the work. When she visited the stables, she paid particular attention to Sterling, her eyes narrowing as she watched the horse interact with Elliot and the dogs. The animal's quirks still unsettled her, the barking, the dog-like antics, the tendency to follow commands as if he were a four-legged sheepdog instead of a horse. Yet there was no denying his intelligence, or the quiet joy he brought to the yard. One late afternoon, as sunlight slanted gold across the fields, Lady Caroline stood by the paddock fence while Victoria led Sterling through his paces. Elliot and the dogs followed at a respectful distance, their shadows long on the grass. Lady Caroline watched in silence as Sterling responded to Victoria's gentle cues, moving with a mix of canine enthusiasm and equine grace. After a while, she turned to Victoria, her voice low and thoughtful, not meant for others to hear. "Let's see how he manages with the herd," she said simply. The words carried weight, a chance for redemption perhaps, or at least a test of belonging. The next morning, Sterling was introduced again to the Exmoor Ponies. The herd was wary, memories of the earlier chaos still fresh. Sterling entered with a careful step, ears flicking back and forth, every muscle tense. The dogs watched from the fence, silent but poised to spring into action if needed. Elliot stood nearby, hands twisting in his sleeves, eyes wide with hope and anxiety. At first, the herd shied away. The stallion pawed the ground, snorting a warning. Sterling stood his ground, head low, posture respectful but resolute. He didn't bark or prance this time. Instead, he moved in slow, measured arcs, copying Barney's herding technique, giving the herd space but never retreating. Gradually, curiosity overcame fear. The younger ponies crept closer, nostrils flaring, while the older mares kept a watchful distance. Sterling stood still, letting them approach, the only movement the slow flick of his tail and the rise and fall of his breath. Elliot captured the scene in his sketchbook, lines quick and confident. For a moment the whole park seemed to pause, the balance of old and new, wild and tame, settling into place. Days passed, each one weaving the newcomers deeper into the fabric of Ashford Park, mornings filled with chores and laughter, afternoons with quiet companionship in the paddocks, evenings with shared meals in the old kitchen. Victoria found herself smiling more, even laughing at Poppy's mischief or Hector's grumpy refusals to move from his favorite spot. The change was gradual, but unmistakable. Where once the estate had felt heavy with secrets and sorrow, it now buzzed with a quiet, persistent hope. The sense that difference was not only tolerated here, but embraced. Under the open sky, surrounded by animals and people who had all survived their own storms, Ashford Park became more than a refuge. It became a place where healing was not only possible, but inevitable, given time, patience, and the loyalty of unlikely friends. You said, "Hey Viet Fan, 5900 Tudolin, Viet Lien Mach Kao Tu, Dunquin Gon Ngu Tieng, An, Mi Cho, Toi, Het, Kak, Fan, Theo Dan I Toi, Da Gui ChatGPT said, "Absolutely." Here's part 5, over 900 words, written in continuous American English with minimal dialogue and focused on mood, emotion, and deepening the story as outlined. Underscore, 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 underscore. Part 5. A Long Goodbye. Spring had finally claimed Ashford Park. painting the lawns in broad strokes of green and letting sunlight pour through the windows at new, generous angles. Evenings lingered longer now, and the gardens hummed with renewed life. Bees in the lavender, robins on the fence posts, the scent of cut grass mixing with the sharp tang of leather from the tack room. But for all the fresh beginnings outside, there was a heaviness inside the heart of the house, an unspoken tension carried quietly by each member of its mismatched family. Hector, the oldest of the dogs, had slowed down over the last few weeks. His steps became deliberate, his naps longer, his eyes following Victoria and the others from his favorite spot beside the barn door. He remained gentle and dignified, accepting treats with a careful mouth, still managing to wag his tail whenever Elliot or Sterling wandered close. Yet, everyone noticed the difference. It was in the way Poppy curled up beside him, offering warmth in her own frantic way, or how Barney kept returning to check on him, nudging him gently with his nose as if to say, "I'm here." The house seemed quieter in the evenings. Everyone tuned in to Hector's breathing, counting the slow, steady rhythm, holding their own breaths when he shifted or sighed. Victoria watched over him as carefully as she'd watched over every injured animal she'd ever saved. But there was nothing more to be done. No medicine, no trick, just patience and presence. Even Sterling sensed the change. He lingered by Hector's side, often lying down next to him in the grass, lowering his head so the old dog could rest a tired chin on his shoulder. The others kept their distance, but Sterling pressed close, a silent promise of comfort. On the first truly warm night of spring, the air heavy with the smell of rain, the moment everyone had quietly dreaded arrived. The sky was a deep navy, streaked with the last pink threads of sunset, when Barney barked softly from the barn. Victoria came running, slippers forgotten, hair falling out of its braid. She found Hector in his usual spot, eyes closed, chest rising with shallow, uneven breaths. Sterling stood over him, nuzzling the old dog's shoulder, Poppy tucked tight at his belly, Barney lying close by, each one a silent witness, each unwilling to let go. Victoria knelt in the straw, smoothing Hector's head with trembling hands. She whispered to him, her words private and low, words of thanks and love and gentle permission to rest. Elliot stood in the shadows, Ranger pressed against his leg, his small hands twisting the hem of his shirt. Tears streaked his cheeks, silent and unacknowledged. But he didn't run away. He watched, face set, eyes dark and wide, not looking at anyone but Hector. The moment stretched, the room filled only with the sound of rain tapping on the old tin roof and the measured, slowing breaths of a life coming gently to its close. Hector slipped away quietly, surrounded by those who loved him most. In that instant, the barn felt both too small and impossibly large, filled with both loss and the memory of every joyful moment shared. Victoria wept silently, face buried in Hector's fur, while the other animals waited, sharing their own quiet grief. Barney rested his head on his paws, eyes fixed on nothing. Poppy curled in tighter, shivering. Sterling pawed at the ground, shifting his weight as if unsure whether to stand or lie down. Rain grew heavier, drumming against the roof and echoing in the rafters. Thunder rumbled far off, a deep, distant growl that seemed to vibrate through the floor. Victoria rose slowly, gathering Hector in her arms, carrying him out into the night. Barney and Poppy followed, heads low, while Sterling trailed behind, his steps slow and uncertain. Elliot came too, holding tightly to Ranger, his face streaked with rain and tears. Together, they made their way to the far edge of the garden, beneath a great oak tree whose roots ran deep and strong. Victoria knelt there, lowering Hector to the soft earth, arranging him carefully. She smoothed the fur one last time, pressing a kiss to his forehead before stepping back, letting the others come close. The dogs sniffed their old friend, one by one, then lay down around him. A circle of warmth and memory, even as the night grew colder. The burial was quiet, each movement deliberate and respectful. Victoria placed a smooth stone at the head of the grave, tracing Hector's name with her finger. The others stood in silence, the only sound the rain easing, then stopping altogether, leaving the world washed clean, but changed forever. Back inside, the emptiness felt sharp, cutting through every familiar routine. Barney wandered the house, restless, looking for something he couldn't find. Poppy whimpered, curling into herself on the hearth. Sterling paced the yard, pausing by the oak tree as if waiting for Hector to return. Elliot withdrew, barely eating, his drawings darker, lines heavier and more chaotic. Victoria let the grief move through her like a tide, sometimes gentle, sometimes crashing. She tried to comfort the others, holding Poppy through the night, sitting quietly beside Barney, brushing Sterling's mane until her arms ached. Yet she knew that nothing she said or did would fill the space Hector had left. Loss was a wound that healed in its own time, invisible but real, marked in the way everyone moved a little slower, spoke a little softer. In the days that followed, a new order emerged, one shaped by absence, but also by memory. Barney took to sleeping in Hector's spot, vigilant and grave. Poppy, more subdued, stayed close to Victoria. Sterling watched over them all, patient and protective, his presence now the glue that kept the fragile family together. Even Elliot, in his silence, drew pictures of Hector under the oak tree, his pencil strokes gentler, his lines beginning to soften as the world found its balance again. Spring carried on, indifferent to loss, offering new beginnings, even as the old were honored and grieved. Ashford Park breathed with the change, each member of its unlikely family carrying forward a piece of what was lost and making space, day by day, for whatever might come next. You said, "Hey Viet Fan 6900 Tudolen, Viet Lien Mak, Kao Tu, Dunquen Gon Gu Tieng, An Mi Cho Toi, Het Kak Fan, Theo Den I Toi Da Gui." ChatGPT said, "Certainly, here's part 6, written continuously in American English over 900 words, focused on Sterling's gradual transformation, the evolving dynamics at Ashford Park, and the resilience that starts to surface as they navigate grief. Underscore, 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 underscore." Part 6, Learning to Lead. Grief hung in the air at Ashford Park, like the morning fog, slow to lift, seeping into every corner of the old estate. The absence of Hector was felt in every routine, one less dish at breakfast, one less shadow by the door, the hush where his gentle presence had been, a constant, anchoring everyone through years of storms and sunshine. The dogs seemed unmoored. Barney grew restless, pacing and pausing in doorways, ears pricked as if expecting the old Labrador's patient shuffle. Poppy curled tighter into herself, clinging to Victoria and trailing after her with nervous eyes. Even the ponies sensed the change, skittish and subdued, as if nature itself paid respect to the passing of a spirit that had quietly ruled the pack. But spring persisted. Green returned to the hedgerows, new lambs dotted the distant fields, and sunlight streamed in through clean windows. Life, as it always does, pressed forward, offering small moments of hope. It was Sterling who felt the shift most keenly. For days after Hector's passing, he haunted the places the old dog had favored, waiting by the stable doors at dawn, sniffing the patch of earth beneath the oak, lying for hours where Hector had once stretched out in the afternoon light. At first, he was listless and lost, more withdrawn than ever, wary of loud noises or sudden movements, always keeping the dogs in his sights. But gradually, something in Sterling began to change. Perhaps it was the way Barney tried and failed to fill Hector's place, his attempts to corral Poppy, to keep the daily rounds in order. Perhaps it was the subtle shift in Victoria's voice when she spoke to him, a new note of reassurance and expectation. Or perhaps it was simply the stubborn resilience that had kept Sterling alive through so much already. One morning, when mist still clung to the grass, Sterling watched as a pair of lambs, having wriggled through a broken fence, began to wander dangerously close to the rose beds. Barney barked a warning, but Poppy darted in the wrong direction, scattering the lambs further. For a long moment Sterling stood motionless, ears flicked back, uncertain. Then, slowly, as if remembering something deep and old, he stepped forward. He lowered his head, ears pricked, and, awkwardly at first, began to circle the lambs, using wide arcs like he'd seen Barney do countless times. The lambs turned, confused, then followed his lead, bleating softly. Barney watched, almost incredulous, as Sterling nudged them gently away from the flowers and back toward the open gate. Poppy, catching on, ran to help, her energy finally channeled in the right direction. Together, they herded the lambs back through the gap, where they trotted off to join the rest of the flock, tails flicking. Victoria watched the entire scene from the porch, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, her heart tight with a mix of pride and astonishment. The others noticed too. Elliot, hidden behind a low fence, sketched the moment quickly, capturing Sterling's awkward grace and the gentle determination in his eyes. Even Lady Caroline, observing from the parlor window, allowed herself a rare, genuine smile. After that morning, something unlocked in Sterling. Each day, he took on more of the responsibilities that had belonged to Hector, leading the patrol around the boundaries with Barney and Poppy, watching the gates at dusk, alert to any sign of trouble. The dogs responded, falling into step beside him, their confidence growing as Sterling found his stride. The new dynamic was not without hiccups. Poppy remained irrepressible, forever darting off at the scent of a rabbit, and Barney's gruff attempts at discipline sometimes ended with the three of them tangled in a heap of fur and hooves. Yet there was laughter again, rippling through the yard, moments of lightness as Sterling learned, day by day, what it meant to be a leader, not through dominance, but through presence and care. Major Grant, watching from his favorite bench beneath the sycamore, noted Sterling's progress with a mixture of approval and surprise. He remarked to Victoria one afternoon, in his usual clipped manner, that there was more to leadership than bloodlines or instinct, that sometimes the best guardians are the ones who have known the most fear. His words hung in the air, not needing a reply. Elliot began to draw Sterling in new ways, no longer as the odd horse who barked, but as a quiet protector, a figure of courage and kindness. He filled pages with images. Sterling wearing a makeshift police cap fashioned from old felt, Sterling guiding lost ducklings back to the pond, Sterling standing sentinel at the gate as the evening mist rolled in. The drawings were full of life and gentle humor, and when Victoria found them tucked under her door, she smiled and placed them where everyone could see. One afternoon, Victoria found herself sitting on the porch steps, the air thick with the scent of new grass and distant rain. Sterling grazed nearby, Barney and Poppy resting in the shade. She watched as Elliot, emboldened by the change in atmosphere, brought out a basket of apples, offering one to each animal in turn. Sterling accepted his with a nod, then leaned down to nuzzle Elliot's hair, the gesture careful and grateful. Victoria closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of contentment settle around her. It was not lost on anyone that Sterling's journey mirrored their own, rising from loss, stumbling into unexpected responsibility, and learning that family, however strange or broken, could find a new balance. The estate was changing, no longer a place weighed down by the past, but one shaped, quietly, by the courage of those who stayed and tried again. Evenings now ended with Sterling leading the others along the fence line, pausing to watch the sun slip behind the hills. The laughter and light returned, filling the gaps left by grief, until Ashford Park felt almost whole again. The healing was slow, but it was real, written in every small kindness, every shared task, and the trust that had begun to grow, not just between animal and human, but between each broken mending heart that called this place home. You said, "Hey Viet fan, 7900 tu do len, Viet lien mach kau tu, dung quent ngon ngu tieng an mi cho toi het kak pan, theodan shi toi da gui," ChatGPT said. Absolutely. Here's part 7, written in continuous American English, well over 900 words, focusing on atmosphere, action, tension, and the pivotal events of the night when danger finally comes to Ashford Park. Underscore, 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 underscore. Part 7, The Night of Shadows. As dusk settled over Ashford Park, a restless wind moved through the hedgerows, rattling branches and tossing petals from the first open roses. There was a hush in the paddocks that evening, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. The routines of the day were nearly done. Victoria moved through the stables with practiced care, checking on each horse, running her hands along strong necks and brushing mud from legs. The dogs clustered around her, Barney, vigilant as always, Poppy weaving between boots and hay, Sterling hovering just outside the circle of yellow light cast by the lanterns. Elliot lingered in the barn's shadow, eyes fixed on the gathering darkness, his hand resting on Ranger's sturdy back. There was a tension to his stillness, an old anxiety flaring. Victoria caught his gaze and gave a quiet nod, wordless reassurance. But something about the night felt wrong. As the sun dropped below the hills, clouds gathered thick and low. The staff trickled out, doors locked and gates double-checked as usual, but no one commented on the unease. Lady Caroline had already retired, her window glowing briefly before the curtains closed. The night pressed in, cold and unfamiliar, as if the estate were holding its breath. It was well after midnight when the first sound broke the calm, a low metallic clink, quickly muffled. In the far distance, near the old service gate, flashlights flickered, shadows sliding through the hedges, too many feet moving in practiced silence. The Cole gang had come, their figures dark and purposeful, their dogs, lurchers bred for speed and cunning, kept close on short leashes. They moved with the precision of men who'd watched, waited, and planned. Inside, Sterling's ears pricked, muscles tensing, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of strangers and the sharp tang of fear. Barney lifted his head, hackles raised, every sense alert. Poppy growled, a sound so low it barely vibrated the air. Victoria, restless in her room, sat up suddenly, a chill running down her spine. The thieves scaled the side fence and fanned out across the grounds, flashlights flickering over the sleeping Exmoor ponies, and the foals bedded down for the night. One of the lurchers slipped free, darting into the shadows, its handler cursing under his breath. A soft whistle, A signal. It was all unfolding with brutal efficiency, every movement honed by greed and experience. Sterling moved first. He pushed through the stall door, hooves barely making a sound on the straw, and slipped out into the yard. Barney and Poppy flanked him, silent shadows at his side. At the barn door, Sterling paused, eyes narrowed, heart pounding. He caught the faint movement of men near the pony paddock, the harsh glint of metal, the tense whispers of men who did not belong. He surged forward. In the dark, his white mane glowed faintly, a ghostly flag as he barreled toward the intruders. He let out a deep, guttural bark, a sound that cut through the quiet and sent the lurchers scattering in confusion. The gang cursed, one stumbling backward as Sterling reared and planted himself between the thieves and the ponies. His presence was startling, almost supernatural, a force too wild to reason with. Barney darted left, circling behind the nearest man, snapping at his ankles. Poppy shot forward, teeth flashing, latching onto the hem of a jacket, and refusing to let go. Sterling stomped, tossing his head, making himself bigger, his breath steaming in the cold air. One of the thieves lunged with a heavy stick, swinging at Sterling's legs. He sidestepped, hooves digging furrows in the earth, and lashed out with a kick that sent the stick spinning into the darkness. The lurchers yelped, tangling their leads, barking in confusion as the dogs defended their ground with a courage that left no room for doubt. Inside the house, Ranger shot upright, growling low in his throat. Elliot bolted awake, heart hammering, sensing danger. He grabbed his flashlight, and without waiting for the adults, hurried down the back stairs, Ranger pressed to his side. The boy slipped out the kitchen door, drawn toward the chaos unfolding in the paddock. Victoria was only a few steps behind, her mind racing as she caught the distant shouts and the wild barking. She saw Sterling, impossibly brave, blocking the way, dogs snapping and weaving around him, the thieves trying and failing to drive them back. Adrenaline surged. She grabbed the nearest pitchfork and raced toward the fight. The gang's leader, Darren Cole, realized the tide was turning. He barked orders, calling his men to regroup, signaling for a quick retreat, but the plan was unraveling. The dogs were everywhere. The horse was relentless, and now lights were flaring from the manor. Major Grant, already limping down the drive, flashlight in hand, shouting for help. A chase broke out across the darkened lawn. Flashlights bobbed, feet pounded, the barking grew wild and desperate. One of the thieves tried to vault the fence, but Barney was there first, driving him back with well-timed snaps. Sterling herded the panicked foals into a tight group, standing guard until the last thief stumbled into the brush and vanished. For a few long minutes, it was nothing but chaos. The sound of hooves, feet, barking, shouts, the clang of a gate swinging open and shut. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise faded. The gang melted into the shadows, leaving behind trampled grass, a torn jacket, and the memory of a night when nothing had gone as planned. Sterling, sides heaving, stood watch over the trembling foals. Barney and Poppy regrouped, both battered but proud, their eyes shining in the lantern light. Victoria reached them, breathless and shaking, her arms wrapping around Sterling's neck as she pressed her forehead to his mane. Elliot arrived next, face pale but determined. Ranger pressed to his side, both boy and dog wide-eyed but unbroken. As the first streaks of dawn touched the sky, Lady Caroline stood at her window, surveying the aftermath. Ashford Park was safe. For now. The danger had passed, but something fundamental had changed. Sterling, covered in sweat and mud, stood taller than ever. No longer just a misfit, but a true protector, his courage stitched forever into the story of the land and those who called it home. The sun rose on a place both shaken and united, where loyalty and bravery had triumphed, if only for a night, over the shadows that waited just beyond the fence. You said, Hey Viet Pan, 8900 tu Do Len, Viet Lien Mach Cao Tu, Dung Quen Ngon Ngu Tieng, An Mi Cho Toi Het Kak Fan, Theo Den I Toi Da Gui, ChatGPT said. Certainly, here is part 8, written continuously in American English over 900 words following your outline. This part focuses on the aftermath of the break-in, the emotional turning point for Elliot, the actions of the adults, and the spirit of renewal that begins to blossom at Ashford Park. Underscore, 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 underscore. Part 8, Turning the Tide. Dawn crept slowly over Ashford Park, gold pushing back the shadows and setting the dew on the grass ablaze. The world seemed to exhale, as if the land itself was grateful to have survived the night. The battered paddock bore the scars of the struggle. Trampled earth, a split gate, hoofprints tangled with footprints, and stray tufts of fur snagged on wire. Yet the air hummed with relief. The horses, though restless, were safe. The dogs, sore and panting, gathered around Sterling, who stood like a sentinel at the center of it all, mud-splattered, sides heaving, but resolute. Victoria moved among them, checking for injuries, her hands gentle and efficient. Barney bore a scratch along his ear. Poppy limped on a sore paw, but both seemed more proud than pained. Sterling's coat was streaked with sweat and grime, but his eyes were clear, alert. He lowered his head for Victoria's touch, shuddering once and then breathing out deeply, as if letting go of all the fear and tension that had knotted inside him. Major Grant surveyed the aftermath with military precision. He helped the groundskeeper secure the broken gate, marking the spots where the thieves had slipped in and out. Lady Caroline stood nearby, her usual poise tempered by a rare softness in her gaze. She watched as the staff gathered, murmuring about the night's events, their words colored by a new respect for the animals, especially for Sterling, whose actions had held the gang at bay. Inside the manor, Elliot sat on the kitchen floor, his arms wrapped around Ranger. The dog licked his cheek, tail thumping a steady rhythm against the tiles. Elliot's eyes were red, but his breathing had steadied. He replayed the night's chaos in his mind, the cold air, the barking, the flash of flashlights, the shadowy shapes of men who did not belong. For a moment he had been frozen, locked in fear and memory. But then he'd seen Sterling standing firm, the dogs rushing to protect, Victoria running out with nothing but courage and an old pitchfork. In that instant, something inside Elliot shifted. The world didn't shrink. It expanded, making space for bravery, for loyalty, for hope. Victoria knelt beside him, her hand light on his shoulder. She didn't ask questions. She just sat with him, the kitchen filling with the quiet clatter of breakfast and the smells of tea and toast. Major Grant joined them, settling heavily into a chair, his presence solid and comforting. No one tried to fill the silence with chatter. They simply let the morning come. Later, Lady Caroline called everyone into the old dining room. The mood was somber but determined. She spoke not just as the head of the house, but as someone who had witnessed the best in her strange patchwork family. She praised the courage shown during the attack, the quick thinking, the unity, the bravery of animals and people alike. There was no reprimand for Sterling's dog-like antics, no judgment for chaos, only gratitude and pride. Then, a new resolve took hold. The attack had shaken them, yes, but it also drew them closer. Lady Caroline proposed an idea that had long simmered at the edges of conversation, but now took on new urgency. They would establish a sanctuary at Ashford Park, a place not just for horses and dogs, but for people too, children who needed healing, veterans seeking purpose, those whom the world had left behind. They would call it Harmony Stables. The name lingered in the air, full of possibility. Work began at once. The staff repaired the damage, strengthened fences, and installed new lights. Victoria and Major Grant met with local law enforcement, sharing what they knew of the Cole Gang's tactics. The police promised to patrol more frequently. But it was clear that Ashford Park's best defense would always be its own community. The animals, the people, the routines that bound them all together. Through it all, Elliot changed in subtle but profound ways. He spent more time outdoors, Ranger always by his side. He helped Victoria in the stables, mending harnesses, brushing manes, even learning to lead Sterling with a gentle hand. The bond between boy and horse deepened. Sterling would wait for Elliot each morning, nudging his shoulder, following him from paddock to paddock with quiet devotion. The dogs resumed their patrols, Barney resuming his leadership, Poppy bounding ahead, spirit undimmed by injury. The staff and volunteers, inspired by the resilience of the animals, pitched in with renewed energy. The routines of the estate gained new meaning. What had once been a collection of tasks became a shared purpose, a promise to protect, to nurture, to welcome anyone who needed a second chance. One afternoon, as Victoria led a tour for potential donors, Elliot was invited to join. At first, he hung back, uncertain, but Sterling sidled close, his presence reassuring. Victoria introduced the boy not just as a helper, but as family. The visitors watched as Elliot moved among the horses, calm and confident, a quiet testament to the healing power of this place. When asked about Sterling, Victoria smiled and explained his history. The orphaned foal, the horse raised by dogs, the misfit who found his calling as a guardian. It was after that tour, when the day was nearly done and the sky blazed orange, that the most remarkable moment occurred. A new volunteer was leading a nervous pony toward the stable when the animal spooked, rearing back and scattering the group. The commotion startled Elliot. His hands shook. For a second, the old fear threatened to return, but Sterling was there. The horse pressed in close, breathing slow and steady, nudging Elliot's arm. Ranger circled, sitting at the boy's feet. Elliot closed his eyes, breathed in time with Sterling, and then, clear as sunrise, spoke his first words since his father's death. "It's okay," he whispered, voice trembling, but sure. "I'm not afraid." Victoria, standing nearby, blinked back tears. The staff froze, stunned by the suddenness and the certainty in Elliot's voice. For a heartbeat, the whole world seemed to hold still. Then, as if a spell had broken, laughter and applause filled the air. The joy was contagious, rolling through the paddocks carried by dogs barking and horses' whinnies. That evening, the family gathered on the porch as the first stars appeared. The wounds of the past night were not gone, but healing had begun, faster and deeper than anyone could have hoped. Ashford Park was no longer just a sanctuary for misfits and strays. It had become a place of hope, of courage, and of harmony, where every broken soul could find the strength to speak, to stand, and to belong. You said, "Hey Viet Fan, 9900 tu do len, Viet Lien mak kau tu, Dunquin gon nguting, an mi cho toa, hit kak fan, theodan yi toi dagoi," ChatGPT said. Certainly. Here is part 9, written in continuous American English, over 900 words, focusing on the grand opening of Harmony Stables, the blossoming of hope, and the ways in which the healing spirit of Ashford Park transforms everyone, animal and human alike. Underscore, 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 part 9, Harmony Stables. The morning of the Harmony Stables grand opening broke bright and clear, sunlight pouring through the hedgerows and gilding every rooftop, every fence post, every blade of grass. There was a rare sense of anticipation in the air, a gentle buzz of hope that seemed to ripple out from the manor and across the grounds. All week, preparations had taken over the estate. Staff and volunteers worked side by side, painting signs, decorating the barn with garlands, sweeping the stable yards until they shone. It was a celebration, yes, but it was also a promise, to themselves and to every visitor, that Ashford Park was ready to begin again. Victoria was the first to rise, her heart pounding with something between nerves and joy. She moved quietly through the kitchen, putting on water for tea, glancing out the window at the banners swaying above the main gate. Sterling was already awake, standing by the paddock fence, Barney and Poppy close at his side. The trio watched her, calm but alert, as if they too understood the importance of the day. Soon, the rest of the house came alive. Lady Caroline moved through the halls with her usual poise, inspecting every detail, giving small, decisive nods of approval. Major Grant adjusted his tie in the mirror, his limp a little less noticeable with the extra spring in his step. Elliot appeared in the kitchen, hair still tousled from sleep but eyes bright, clutching his sketchbook to his chest. He glanced at Victoria, offered a quick, shy smile, and turned to Ranger, who waited patiently for his cue. Guests began to arrive. Neighbors from the village, children from nearby schools, local officials, even a few journalists drawn by the story of the horse who barked. Cars filled the drive, laughter and conversation spilling across the lawns. A troop of children from a special school in Exeter poured out of a minibus, their faces alight with excitement. Some ran straight for the paddocks, hands outstretched, while others hung back, nerves visible, hope mingling with uncertainty. Victoria led the first tour, introducing Sterling as both a survivor and a teacher. She explained how he had grown up believing he was a dog, how he had learned courage and loyalty from Barney, Poppy, and Hector. The children giggled when Sterling tossed his mane and pawed at the ground, echoing a dog's playbow. One of the braver boys, a little red-haired child with an arm in a cast, held out a carrot. Sterling accepted it gently, lips soft, eyes kind. The ice was broken. In the next paddock, volunteers helped a group of autistic children mount the Exmoor Ponies. The animals stood calm and patient as small hands clung to reins. Wide eyes flicked between nervousness and joy. The gentle rhythmic motion of the ride worked magic. Children who had arrived silent began to hum and sing. Some, too shy to speak, began to whisper to their ponies, trusting secrets to soft ears. The laughter of children and the soft snorts of ponies mingled in the air. Among the crowd was a group of military veterans, some leaning on canes, others walking with the straight-backed bearing that never fully leaves a soldier. One man, his hands trembling, was led by Major Grant to Sterling's paddock. He paused, uncertain, but Sterling approached, bowing his head so the man could rest a hand on his neck. There was a long, heavy silence, a moment thick with memory, pain, and relief, before the man began to speak, his voice breaking the spell as he described the horse he'd loved as a boy. Major Grant clapped him on the shoulder. Around them, conversation swelled. Walls came down. Inside the barn, Victoria set up a table with paints and paper, inviting children to draw their favorite animals. Elliot found a seat at the end, sketchbook open, his pencil flying as he captured moments. Sterling grazing beneath the sycamore, a girl braiding Poppy's fur, a volunteer laughing as Barney tried to herd a runaway duckling. For the first time, Elliot's sketches were not just for himself, but for the world. Other children crowded around, asking for pictures, and Elliot handed them out with a hesitant pride. Sterling was everywhere. He trotted beside children, taught a newborn foal the bow-wow trick, and nuzzled the hands of those most in need of comfort. His presence was a bridge between nervous children and calm ponies, between veterans and the peace they'd sought, between the old wounds of Ashford Park and the new hope blossoming at Harmony Stables. At midday, Lady Caroline took the small stage set up beneath the big oak. She spoke with gravity and warmth, her words weaving together the history of the estate, the trials they had faced, and the future they had chosen. She praised Victoria's compassion, the dog's loyalty, the courage of everyone who had stepped forward when it mattered most. Her voice faltered just once when she spoke of Hector, the old Labrador whose absence still lingered, but she recovered, her gaze sweeping the crowd. Finally, Elliot was invited to the stage. For a moment he hesitated, then walked up, clutching his sketchbook, Ranger pacing by his side. The crowd fell silent as he looked out, searching for Victoria, then Sterling. He found them both, standing together, and drew a breath. His speech was short. His voice, though soft, carried across the lawn. Harmony isn't just a word. It's what happens when everyone gets a chance to belong. Thank you for helping me find my voice. Thank you for letting us all come home. There was a pause. Then a surge of applause, bright and sudden, filling every corner of Ashford Park. Sterling whinnied, Poppy barked, and Barney raced in circles, herding invisible sheep. Tears glistened in Victoria's eyes as she joined the others in celebration. As the afternoon stretched on, Harmony Stables became a place alive with possibility. Children rode, veterans walked the trails, dogs napped in the sun. There were new friendships made, old wounds eased, and promises formed for all the days to come. That night, after the guests had gone, Victoria, Lady Caroline, Major Grant, Elliot, and the animals gathered beneath the oak tree. No speeches were needed. They sat in quiet gratitude, surrounded by the land and the love that had carried them through every storm. Ashford Park was changed, and in that change, it had become whole. Harmony wasn't just the name above the gate. It was the lesson written in every life saved, every kindness given, every brave new beginning. And as dusk settled over the fields, the promise of hope, bright, stubborn, and real, remained. Woven into the heart of the home they had built together, you said, "Hey Viet Fan, 900 tu do len, Viet lien mach kao tu, dung quen ngon ngu tieng, an mi cho toi, het kak fan, theo dan I toi da gui." ChatGPT said, "Absolutely." Here is part 10, over 900 words, written continuously in American English, focusing on reflection, meaning, and the powerful lessons drawn from everything that happened at Ashford Park. This is the emotional and philosophical conclusion, weaving together the story's themes and offering closure and hope. Underscore, 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 underscore. Part 10, the heart of the matter. In the days and weeks after the grand opening of Harmony Stables, life at Ashford Park settled into a new and deeper rhythm. The excitement of the celebration faded into something richer, a quiet contentment, a steady pulse of gratitude that flowed through the kitchen at breakfast, the fields at dusk, and the soft lamplight of evenings spent together. Each member of the household found their own way to make sense of what they'd lived through, to give meaning to the months of fear, loss, struggle, and hope. Victoria often rose before sunrise, walking the fields alone, her boots leaving a trail in the dew. She moved from paddock to paddock, pausing to watch the ponies graze, and the first rays of sunlight set the world aglow. She stopped longest at Sterling's fence. The Gypsy Cob would always meet her there, head lifted, breath misting in the morning air. Sometimes she talked to him in a low voice, confessing worries or small joys. She knew now, as surely as she knew the shape of his scars, that difference was not a flaw to be hidden, but a gift to be honored. One morning she found herself staring out across the fields, thinking back to that first storm, to the frightened foal in the snow, to the risk she took in choosing compassion over reputation. In that moment, the lesson she'd carried through all the hardship came clear. True healing does not begin with fixing what's broken, but with accepting it, making a home for it, loving it anyway. Sterling, too, had changed, not just in the eyes of others, but in his own quiet way. He moved through the world with calm purpose, no longer a misfit, but a leader whose authority was rooted in kindness. He continued his patrols with Barney and Poppy, kept watch over the foals and lambs, nudged open gates with his nose, and, when the mood struck him, still barked with joy at the rising sun. Sometimes new guests would ask about the dog horse, and Victoria would laugh, explaining that every soul who found sanctuary at Harmony Stables brought their own story, their own way of being. Sterling simply made it safe for everyone else to be exactly who they were. Elliot's transformation was the one most felt by all. The boy who had once moved like a shadow now ran through the fields with Ranger at his side, his laughter echoing over the hills. He became a bridge between the children who visited, the shy, the wounded, the uncertain, and the animals who welcomed them. He taught others how to groom a pony, how to trust a dog's gentle nudge, how to draw the world as you saw it, not as you were told it should be. He spoke little still, but when he did, people listened. His voice was quiet but unwavering, each word a small miracle. Lady Caroline, for her part, learned to see beyond order and tradition, embracing a vision of Ashford Park that included muddy boots, untidy laughter, and the unpredictable chaos of healing. She spent afternoons in the sun, reading while Poppy napped at her feet, greeting every child and veteran who passed through the gates with a warmth that surprised even herself. Once, as she watched Sterling lead a line of children around the paddock, she whispered, almost to herself, that the estate had finally found its calling. Major Grant found his burdens eased, the sharp pain of old wounds softened by purpose. He took pride in the routines of the place, fencing, mending, teaching boys from the village to drive nails straight and not be afraid of hard work. He led quiet conversations with the veterans who visited, offering a listening ear and sometimes a quiet, companionable silence. In Sterling, he saw a reflection of his own journey, battered but unbroken, transformed by service and trust. Harmony Stables grew into its new name. More families arrived, parents searching for a safe space for anxious children, soldiers in need of something solid after the uncertainty of war, lost souls who found, if not answers, then at least acceptance. Therapy sessions with horses became a daily routine. The cost was modest, the benefit vast. Lives steadied, hearts mended, hope rekindled. Victoria began to dream bigger. Partnerships with the local hospital, workshops for teachers, visits from therapists who wanted to learn about the healing power of animals. One afternoon, a small film crew arrived to make a documentary about the stables. They interviewed Victoria under the old oak, asked her what she thought made Harmony Stables different from any other place. She smiled, then turned to the camera and spoke, her words clear and steady. Sterling never tried to be a perfect horse. He never hid who he was. That's why he became the heart of this place. Here, we believe difference is not something to outgrow or overcome. It's the bridge that connects us all, wounded or whole, old or young, rich or poor. What started as a family tradition has grown into a living proof that kindness can cross any boundary. As she spoke, Elliot sketched quietly at her side, capturing the image of Sterling surrounded by dogs and children, Lady Caroline in her sun hat, Major Grant standing tall in the background. The picture became a symbol, one that would hang in the main hall, a reminder of what they had built together. The message grew. Other farms called to ask how they could start similar programs. The local NHS began to refer patients. The boundary between the estate and the world outside blurred, and the lessons of Ashford Park began to ripple outward. The closing of the documentary and the closing of their journey belonged to Victoria. She stood once more at Sterling's fence, the sunset glowing on his coat, and looked directly into the lens. Her voice was quiet but powerful. Difference is not a weakness, not a failing. It's our greatest strength. When we accept it in ourselves and others, we don't just heal, we change the world. And so Harmony Stables continued. Each day brought new struggles, new joys, new people seeking shelter. But within its gates, no one was ever truly alone. Kindness was the law, courage the currency, and every story, no matter how broken, found a place to belong. As darkness fell, and the lights of Ashford Park shone out into the countryside, the estate stood as a beacon, a living proof that healing, like hope, is something best shared.